guys, today we're going to talk about the electrical anatomy and physiology of the heart. So let's get started and let's do a little review first. Remember that our heart has 4 chambers, 2 atria and 2 ventricles. We have our right atrium, left right ventricle, and left ventricle. If you remember from our good old A&P days, whenever the right atria contracts, it sends the blood to the right ventricle. When the left atrium contracts, it sends the blood to the left ventricle. The right ventricle sends it to the lungs, and the left ventricle sends it to the rest of the body. In order for the atria to contract and the ventricles to contract, we need to have electrical conduction. Without an electrical conduction or an electrical stimulation, we will not have any type of mechanical action. So let's talk a little bit more about mechanical action. Mechanical action is simply referring to the ability to contract. That's all, just the heart's ability to be able to contract. In order for the heart to contract, it goes through a cardiac cycle. And so when it's going through this cardiac cycle, it's going to start at the atria. So again, having our right atria and our left atria, whenever the atrium contract, it's also called depolarize or to so whenever I say atrial depolarization, it means the exact same thing as the atria are contracting. It's just fancier words that we got to use in healthcare. So then with our right ventricle and left ventricle, when these contract, it is also called ventricular depolarization, or the ventricles contract. So whenever the atria depolarize, they pump the blood to the ventricles, right? And so by them doing that, the ventricles are resting during this time because they have to fill up with the blood that's coming in. Once the ventricles are done filling up with the blood, they pump the blood either to the lungs or to the body like they're supposed to. So just remember this. If you can remember that repolarize, the RE right here, and rest starts with RE, means that either the atria or the ventricles are resting, you'll remember that depolarize means to contract. So I want to recap this one more time just because it's really important for you to understand it. When the atria contract, they are depolarizing, and the blood is going to the ventricles. Therefore, the ventricles have got to be resting so that they can fill with blood during this time. So that would be ventricular repolarization. When the ventricles are done filling up with blood and they pump the blood to the lungs or the body, then it's the atria's turn to relax. So this is called atrial repolarization because they are resting while the ventricles contract and the atria are filling up with blood from the superior or inferior vena cava or the lungs. Now, the mechanical action of the atria contracting and the ventricles contracting is what produces a waveform on an EKG. And that's where you see the PQRSTs, and we will talk about those in a different lecture. So in order for all this to take place, in order for the mechanical action to take place, we have got to have an electrical stimulation. Without it, our little hearts will not pump. And so the electrical conduction is a pathway that we must have in order for the electricity to travel from the top to the bottom. It starts in the SA node, the AV node follows it, and then down the bundle of His, the right and left bundle branches, and the Purkinje fibers. So let's talk about these in a little bit more detail. So the SA node. The SA node is very, very important. It hangs out right here. The SA node sends an electrical impulse to the atria, across the atria. So once it does that, the atria contract. And this is what sends the blood down the ventricles. So the SA node sends a signal of about 60 to 100 beats per minute. If you recall, what's a normal heart rate? 60 to 100 beats per minute. So that's because that's how often the atria is firing. So it's just continuously doing something like this and sending an electrical impulse. What is so cool about the atria, because it is called the natural pacemaker of the heart, what's so cool about it is that it does not require a signal or any type of stimulus from any other organ in the body. It doesn't need the brain for it to fire electricity. It needs nothing. This is why a lot of people, when they are considered brain dead, the atria still fires. It does not need the brain to signal. So when people are brain dead, they still have a blood pressure, they still have a heart rate, but that's because this little guy right here is still working. It automatically sends an electrical impulse. It does not need anybody else to tell it what to do. So after the electrical impulse travels down the SA node, it goes to the AV node. The first thing the AV node does is it slows down the electrical impulse from the SA node. So our AV node is right here. After the SA node fires, the AV node slows it down just enough to make sure that the atria has finished contracting, because it wants to make sure that all the blood has gone into the ventricles. So once the atria finishes contracting, the AV node then sends the electrical impulse further down. One cool thing to understand about the AV node is that it has an intrinsic rate of 40 to 60 beats per minute. And basically what this means is if the SA node decides, I'm done, I'm not going to fire anymore, well, the heart's not going to just let you die. So the AV node is going to take over, and it's going to produce an electrical impulse of about 40 to 60 beats per minute so that the heart can still contract, because it doesn't want to die. It's not ready. And so just because the SA node decides it stops, the heart backs itself up. So again, this only happens if it needs to. So after the electrical conduction has gone down the AV node, then it goes down to the bundle of His. And the bundle of His is right here. And what the bundle of His does is it just gets the electrical impulse, and then it separates into the right and into the left bundle branches. When it does that, it sends the electrical impulses to the ventricles, the right ventricle and the left ventricle, so that these contract. Another cool thing about the right and left bundle branches, it also has the intrinsic rate. So what that means is if the SA node decides, nah, I'm done, the AV node says, nah, I'm not doing it either. Well, the right and left bundle branches say, you know what? I'm not ready to die. Let's make a heartbeat. So it starts sending an electrical impulse so that the heart can still somehow beat at a rate of 20 to 40 beats per minute. If you think about it, that's not a lot. This is temporary. This is just going to maintain that person halfway alive until an intervention is done. And what do y'all think the intervention would be to fix this, to bring our patient back so they don't die? A pacemaker. When this person gets a pacemaker, it replaces the SA node and it starts sending off an electrical impulse down the pacemaker, which is now the SA node, down the AV node, the bundle of His, and right and left bundle branches. So it is pretty cool if you think about it, how the heart will always protect itself just because one of the pathways decides to stop working. And lastly, the Purkinje fibers. These little fibers are right here, and what these little guys do, they send the impulse to the myocardium. These fibers want to make sure that the heart gets all of the electrical activity and every cell in that myocardium contracts. That's the Purkinje fiber's job. It's very important because it does not leave any cell out of the heart. And so it makes sure that every part contracts. So let's do a little recap and review our key points. In order for the heart to contract, we have to have an electrical conduction. The electrical conduction stimulates the heart to contract, which causes the mechanical action. Without electricity, our heart will not contract. The mechanical action affects the atria and the ventricles, and it causes them to depolarize and repolarize. Remember that depolarize means they are contracting, and repolarize means they are resting. One important thing to remember is if the atria are contracting, the ventricles are resting. There's no way that the atria can contract at the same time as the ventricles, and the ventricles cannot relax at the same time as the atria, because that means the patient's dying. And lastly, all of this is not possible without an electrical stimulation. You got to make sure you understand the pathway of that electrical stimulation. The SA node, AV node, bundle of His, right and left bundle branches, and Purkinje fibers. The heart is one of the most amazing organs that we have, and it functions in ways that it will take care of itself, and it doesn't need anything else to tell it to beat. Our heart will make sure that it does that without any assistance from any other organ. So I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope that you were able to comprehend and it made sense on a little bit of the anatomy and physiology of the heart. Make sure that you check out any other resources that you see or any other lessons regarding the electrical activity of the heart. And as always, make sure that you guys go out and be your best selves today, and happy nursing.